Hi, I'm Paul J., and welcome to the theAnalysis.news podcast. Born in Kansas, Thomas Frank, author of What's the Matter with Kansas, has with great insight revealed the disillusionment of large sections of working people in rural and urban America with the liberal elites that run the Democratic Party. In his recent book, he takes on the contempt that this liberal aristocracy feels towards what they call populism. Here's a quote from the book: "The people know. Opponents of the right should be claiming the high ground of populism, not ceding it to guys like Donald Trump. Indeed, this is so obvious to me that I'm flabbergasted anew every time I see the word abused in this way. How does it help reformers, I wonder, to deliberately devalue the coinage of the American reform tradition? It is my argument that reversing the meaning of populist tells us something important about the people who reversed it. Denunciations of populism, like the ones we hear so frequently nowadays, arise from a long tradition of pessimism about popular sovereignty and democratic participation. And it's that pessimism, that tradition of quasi-aristocratic scorn, that has allowed the paranoid right to flower so abundantly." That again is from the book The People Know by Thomas Frank. Thomas is a political analyst, a historian, a journalist. He co-founded and edited the Baffler magazine, and he's written several books, most notably What's the Matter with Kansas in 2004 and Listen Liberal in 2016. I did a long series of interviews with Thomas about Listen Liberal, and I can attest to the fact that the liberals did not listen. At any rate, his most recent book is The People Know, and I guess that speaks to the same point. Now joining us is Thomas Frank. Thanks for joining us, Thomas.
You got it, Paul. It's great to be here.
So we're going to divide this interview into three parts. Part one, we're going to talk about the history of populism, and especially in the American context. How did this word begin to be used to describe a political movement? Part two, we're going to talk about getting into the heads of these liberal elites and the Trump version of populism, if that's even how one wants to use the word. And then part three, we're going to talk about what would a democratic populist movement look like if one imagines what it should be and what it is today. But let's start with the history. But before we do, talk just a little bit about the title of the book. What was your thinking behind The People Know?
So it's a reference to an American classic that's not widely read anymore. It's a book-length poem by Carl Sandburg called "The People Yes." And Sandburg was, they called him in his heyday of the 1920s and 1930s. They called him the poet of the people, and his whole career was about, making poetry out of the language and the experiences of ordinary people. There's something of a tradition of this in America. So Walt Whitman did the same kind of thing, and there's many others have done it as well. But Sandburg was, in some ways, the best known, the sort of what would you say, the most popular poet who sort of worked in this particular vein. And he wrote this book in 1936, The People Yes. It was a populist book in a populist era. I mean, the 1930s were the great period of celebrating ordinary people, folk traditions, painting WPA murals of average working people. And also at the same time, a time when the labor movement was growing and taking power, and the American government was shifting dramatically to the left. And none of those things are the case anymore, Mr. Paul J. And I mean, the elites in this country are fearful of democracy. We just came out where, just a few years ago, we had an election in which the Democratic candidate, in other words, the legatee of Franklin Roosevelt, referred to, ordinary people as deplorables, in one of the most shocking, sort of statements of the campaign. Now that was Hillary, of course, Hillary Clinton. She apologized for it, but the damage was done. And she also, that is the mindset of leading liberals nowadays. is that there's something wrong with ordinary people. I mean, and they say this, by the way, your listeners might think that this is just so much rhetoric and so much they say this. The first chapter of the book is made up of quotations of these kind of elite liberals in Washington, D.C., denouncing and wringing their hands over ordinary people and how they have abandoned the elites. The people are in the grip, they think, of some grand delusion.
They often, when they attacked Bernie Sanders, meaning the Clinton-esque and Obama-esque, one should add, section of the leadership of the Democratic Party, they often equated Sanders with a kind of Trump, denouncing two forms of populism.
That's right.
Because it's outside the institutional control of them.
Yeah, of them and their beltway doppelgangers in the Republican Party. Yes, that is exactly right. Their definition of populism is not, of course, is not exact and is not even meant to be exact. So in my definition, which begins, where it should begin with the people who coined the term, Bernie Sanders is very much in the populist tradition, and I'm sure we'll talk about him and what happened to him at some point. But Donald Trump is not. Donald Trump is something else. Donald Trump is a classic demagogue, which is another interesting sort of thread in American life, the problem of the demagogue. But it's not the same thing as populism.
Well, they, as you point out in your book, in their minds, because populism just means a politics out of the normal control of institutional two-party politics and quasi-normal two-party politics. Not sure the current Republican Party itself falls into that, but they see anything like that, as you write, as just mob rule.
Yeah,
and it's out of control. It's scary, and these people are defying the normal historical process.
Yes. Now, just so your listeners know, this is not just one or two people here. There's an entire academic discipline now, or it's sort of a quasi-discipline. You know how academia is. There's these sort of places in between departments, but it's called Global Populism Studies, and it's that is their definition of populism, is more or less it's mob rule. It's it's when the people are out of control and they start following these racist demagogues, would-be authoritarians who want to overthrow rule by rightful elites, and by rightful elites, of course, they mean people like themselves, them and their friends.
Yeah, you have a good line in the book. Populism is simply another word for mob rule, a headlong collapse into the tyranny of the majority that our founding fathers so dreaded.
Yeah.
And that's the whole point of Electoral College, which is, as you say, rather ironic that people that don't like populism wound up losing to an institution that was there to fight populism.
Oh, I know. So, I mean, it's riddled with contradictions and ironies. Yeah, the Electoral College. So the founding fathers obviously didn't have the word populism, but they did have that fear of the majority. That is like all runs right through the Federalist Papers and the Constitutional Convention. Alexander Hamilton famously, well, it's actually not clear whether he said it or not. It's one of these apocryphal quotes that he said things like it all the time, but the quote itself, he said he never, he denied saying it. And that is, he at one point was in an argument with his arch enemy, Thomas Jefferson. He said, "Your people, sir, are a great beast." And that's anti-populism. That's kind of the core doctrine of it, that the people are this uncontrollable wild animal. And by the way, there's these great illustrations of that idea in I say they're great. That's of course because I'm the one that found them and put them in the book. But if you go to my website, if you go to tcfrank.com, you can look at a lot of them, of these illustrations of the people as a great beast, and with the word populism inscribed on the people. And this is from the 1890s, and it's the same idea today, of course.
I've made this point in discussing modern slavery. That in the context of America and the enslavement of black African slaves, but that in England, the enslavement was of the Irish and the Welsh and the child labor, which essentially were like child slaves who were white Anglos. The idea of dehumanizing the working class, especially the poor working class, as really being subhuman, it's connected to this idea that if those people ever got in charge of or supported a kind of politics that served them, that's to be feared.
Yes, and that is one of the themes that runs right through the history of populism is, or I should say of what I call anti-populism, is this fear that when if you were to actually succeed with what the populists wanted to do, which is to make a grand appeal to working people on class interest rather than on, racial interest or something like that, race discrimination or white supremacy or something like that. If they were to ever do that and succeed with that, there would be hell to pay. And they have succeeded in American history. There have been instances where that sort of thing appealed. And all my life, I've been waiting for it to work again.
Talk about the history in the United States. So where there actually was a movement that self-identified as populist, the People's Party. So what is the history of it?
Yes. And so this is one of the funnier things, Paul, with launching this book is, I got there and put it on Twitter and on Facebook. And there's all of these people who are like, everybody says they've got this model for populism, but nobody knows where, it's as though they don't know that there was of course they don't know. Nobody knows anymore that there was there were people who made up the word, consciously invented the word, and there was an original populist movement. And it's, for me, this is very familiar history because I'm from Kansas. I'm sitting in Kansas right now as I'm speaking to you, and I'm about 20 miles from the spot where the word was coined. Okay. And it begins in the year 1890. Well, it begins before that. There was a group called the Farmers Alliance that started organizing. Back then, the majority of the U.S. population were farmers. Kansas is a farm state. And the farmers were in deep economic trouble. And there's a group called the Farmers Alliance started bringing them together and organizing them to act in their own, figuring out ways to do something about their terrible predicament. This group was enormous, one of the biggest mass movements of all time in American history, and they didn't succeed using the various political methods at hand, and so they went into politics themselves, and they started a third party, and it was the last of the great third party efforts, and also the most successful of them. And they were able to take power in the state of Kansas and in a bunch of other places as well. It overnight became this sort of prairie fire, this huge movement. This is in the year 1890. And when my story begins, it's 1891. The Kansas populists have just gone to a convention in Cincinnati where they have launched their movement on the national level. And they're on their way back to Topeka. And somewhere between Kansas City and Topeka on the train, they were sitting around with a local Democrat and trying to invent a name for a word to describe people who are, members of the People's Party. That's what they called themselves, the People's Party. And they came up with the word populist. And it appeared in a newspaper a few days after that and caught fire. The word caught on and the movement caught on, and the movement grew by leaps and bounds over the next few years. And they ran a guy for president in 1892, didn't succeed, but they won a lot of other offices. They had a delegate, they had a bunch of them in Congress, a bunch of U.S. senators, a lot of governors, mayors, etc. And you want me to just keep going with the story, or how do you want?
Yeah, go ahead. The only question I'd ask at this point is, in the United States, to some extent, and certainly many other parts of the world, a kind of conscious socialist movement was also developing around this time.
Yes.
How influenced was this populist movement with socialist ideas?
Very. So if you want to put aside whatever doctrinal differences they might have had with other left-wing parties at the time, the populist party in America was basically the equivalent of the Labour Party in England or in Australia, and there were other left-wing parties cropping up around the world. One of the things that historians often talk about is why there is no socialist or democratic socialist party in America. And one of the reason is because we did have one. It was populism, and it failed. And we'll get to that part of the story. It failed or was suppressed, depending on how you look at it. But yet there was an effort to start one. And it was these guys in Kansas. And their grand idea, they wrote a manifesto in 1892. It's really something. It's well worth looking up on the internet and reading. Their grand idea was to build a huge union of all the working class reform groups. So unions together with farmer groups, et cetera, and build a gigantic coalition of the working class to challenge the capitalist system. That was the idea. And for a while in America, it looked like it might succeed. So farmers had been having a hard time for 20 years for all sorts of different reasons, because of railroad monopolies, because the currency was contracting, all sorts of other reasons. And then the country went into a terrible economic depression. And in 1894 in America, you had one of the first big nationwide strikes, a railroad strike. Called the Pullman Strike, led by Eugene Debs. You had a march on Washington of unemployed people. This is the first time that had ever happened. It was organized by a populist, and it looked like the Populist Party was perfectly situated to take advantage of the depression that the country was going into.
How large was that march on Washington?
I don't remember how many people participated, maybe 10,000, probably less. It wasn't it wasn't in terms of numbers. It wasn't like the one in 1963 or the one in the 1930s, but it shocked people. It was incredibly shocking. They called it Coxey's Army. And it was headline news all over the United States and was regarded as deeply shocking. And they threw the leader of it in jail once he got to Washington for walking on the grass. Anyhow, this was the people in charge in America at the time. You got to remember were, it would not be right to call them extreme right wingers, because by the standards of their day, they were it. They were the center. They were the left. They were the right. They were the only game in town. But by our standards today, they were extremely conservative. They believed in government having no role in the economy except to prop up banks, to get banks out of trouble. Never helping out unemployed people. The government should intervene to put down strikes. Should intervene to stop any kind of protest movement that rises up. This elite that I'm describing who ruled America were incredibly racist. That's just how they thought about the world. They thought there should be no taxation of incomes or of fortunes, no regulation of railroads or monopolies. That's just how they viewed the world.
It's kind of ironic because so many of the working people now in Kansas and other parts of rural and suburban America who are supporters of Trump or the Republican Party, they have this idea of the good old days.
Yeah, I know.
The good old days, their equals were part of this progressive, populist, socialistic movement. That's what the good old days was.
Well, Paul, yes. You're right. One of the, recurring features of American life that makes everything possible, that makes the whole thing tick, is that we don't remember the past.
Well, Gore Vidal's line on that, right? USA, the United States he changed it to amnesia.
Yeah.
No, from amnesia, he changed it to Alzheimer's. But,
who Studs Terkel once said that to me, like in different words, but that's what he thought was our great problem. We couldn't remember anything.
Well, you can thank the education system for that.
Yes, but you can also thank the powers that be. I mean, you look at the most highly educated people in America running the New York Times, and they use the word populist in this negative sense all the time. They have no recollection of it. They hated it then. They hate it today. anyhow, let's get to the story.
Yeah, keep going. Yeah.
The story comes to an incredible climax here in just a second, which is this. So, the country is in turmoil. Populism looks like it's the wave of the future. It's it's the coming political party. And then, as often happens in American life, one of the two major parties decides to capture this reform sentiment, this protest sentiment that's out there in the country. And in this case, it's the Democratic Party. And the Democrats meet for their convention in 1896, and they toss the incumbent president, Grover Cleveland, overboard. They're not going to renominate him, the sitting U.S. president. He's out. And they turn against the gold standard. The gold standard is the great sort of religious faith that props up American capitalism at the time. And the Democratic Party says we're gonna, if we get in, we're taking the country off of gold. And then they nominate for their presidential candidate a 36-year-old from Nebraska named William Jennings Bryan, who's completely unknown, never heard of, and who has just given this incredible speech attacking the gold standard. And they choose this guy for their presidential nominee. And then a few weeks later, the Populist Party, which has met in its convention, says, okay, we're going to Bryan's not perfect. He doesn't, we have all these other issues too, everything from women's suffrage to nationalizing the railroads to the 8-hour day, all these other issues. And he isn't on those, but we'll get on board with him because he looks pretty good. And it's probably the best we can hope for. And so they endorsed him also. And when these two things happened, the elite of the United States went crazy. They went into a kind of hysteria, and I call it a democracy scare. They, the leading newspapers of the country combined with the leading academics of the country, the millionaires, the captains of industry, all of them joined hands and went hysterical together, hysterical that this was happening to them, that one of the two major parties had been, as they saw it, captured by radicalism. And they proceeded to denounce William Jennings Bryan in the most outrageous, shocking terms. And I have a really, in my mind, kind of amusing collection of this. It makes up a whole chapter of the book. I call it, the democracy scare of 1896. Their war on William Jennings Bryan, which is really quite incredible. This airtight consensus among the American elite that this man had to be stopped. He could not become president. And they rolled out, every rhetorical device against this guy, every kind of election day corruption that was sort of available to the 19th century mind was used against him. And they defeated him. And by the way, it was one of the Republican Party raised and spent an extraordinary amount of money, by some standards bigger than has ever been spent to this day. You got to remember, it was unregulated back then. There was no regulation. And the Republican candidate was a guy named William McKinley, senator from Ohio. And his campaign manager was a tycoon from Cleveland called Mark Hanna. Mark Hanna is legendary. Karl Rove imagines himself as a kind of, in the Mark Hanna. He's written a biography of or a book about this moment, this election. Karl Rove has. Anyhow,
J.P. Morgan must be at the center of most of this.
Hanna was the organizer. I don't remember if Morgan.
He's dictating to a large extent
to
the railroads and others. He's creating these monopolies.
I think Morgan was immediately after this election was his heyday, or it might have been right before, but his heyday was right after this. But there were, the other tycoons, all the railroad, Vanderbilt was in full effect, of course. The other tycoons, Rockefeller, of course, Standard Oil was up and running. Carnegie was probably the richest man in the world at the time, U.S. Steel, called Carnegie Steel at the time. But, all of these guys, of course, hated, feared, loathed populism. And Mark Hanna would go, actually at one point in the campaign, went door to door to the headquarters of the great American corporations in Manhattan and said, it's incredible that this happened. He said to them, open the books. And they did. And he said, here's what your profits were last year. We, the Republican Party, the Republican campaign is taking, whatever percent of those profits. That's what you're giving to this campaign as part of the class war to stop William Jennings Bryan. And they paid. They anteed. And this is the kicker of it. The word that they used to describe Bryanism, the fear, the danger of Bryanism, the one word that they settled upon was populism. This is populism. It's mob rule. It's the danger of the mob. They're going to come and overthrow the legitimate government. They don't know what they're doing. They're crazy. They are mentally ill. The whole sort of stereotype that we see nowadays. They want to destroy norms, the way this country has always been run. But above all, what their idea of populism was is that it represented people who had no business ruling, who had no business making laws.
They must have been particularly concerned. You write in the book in the 1880s that the Farmers Alliance, which was sort of the underpinning of all this,
the proto-populists,
that there was also a colored Farmers Alliance that was in alliance with the White Farmers Alliance. That must have really scared the elites.
In the South, it did, yes. So that's a sort of a related story, but slightly different. And so populism had, its stronghold was, the Plains states, Kansas, Nebraska, Colorado, the Dakotas, where it pretty much swept everything before it. But they also were very strong in the South. And the South, obviously a very poor part of America at the time. Obviously, everyone, or the vast majority of the population there, are farmers, largely tenant farmers. And their proposal to the farmers of the South, by the way, was a one-party system. The one party being the Democratic Party, which was the architect of white supremacy. And the way the Democratic Party held power in the South in those days was by appealing to whites, saying that your racial interest is greater than your class interest. Your racial interest, and they did this in a thousand disgusting, loathsome, racist ways. And it's kind of hard to write history about this period because it involves reading really vile stuff. But this was what they called the Bourbon Democrats, the people who ran the South, the ruling elite of the South. And populism rose up against these people. And the proposal that populism made to the farmers of the South was that, no, your class interest is greater than your racial interest. And so populism very famously made an appeal to black farmers as well as white farmers to come together in their common class interest and to do something to, improve their position in life. And this was not idle. This actually had a chance of succeeding. And yes, that was absolutely terrifying to the masters of the South. Absolutely terrifying. And you mentioned what's now referred to as the black populists, and they were not insignificant. They made up a big part of the populist vote in southern states. At the time, African Americans could still vote in a lot of the southern states. And so the populists said, we're going to go out there and compete for their votes. And we're going to, do this obvious thing, which is we're going to give them a better deal than the Democrats are. And oh my God, the story is famous, how the Bourbon Democrats reacted, which is to roll out every imaginable kind of racist device to scare the whites back into line. And when that failed, to use every kind of election day skullduggery to count them out, to make sure that populists did not get elected. They did prevail in one southern state, that's North Carolina. The story there just is incredibly awful, how the Democrats finally got them back. But they did.
So in 1896, you've got this Democratic Party convention. They dump President Grover Cleveland. They nominate William Jennings Bryan. And the elites go nuts. So what happens?
They pull out every stop, and they outspend Bryan in the most. We don't really know because there's no, they didn't have to report. There were no reporting requirements or anything. Probably 20 or 30 to 1. Bryan had virtually no campaign funding at all because obviously he's promising to take the country off the gold standard, which would have ruined, the banking community, and small town, everyone down to small town merchants, would have been in trouble. So they come together as a class to stop him, and he's going around the country. He's kind of a novelty because he's won the nomination of the Democratic Party on the strength of his oratorical ability, and so huge crowds come out to see him.
But why did this getting off the gold standard so appeal to the populace?
Good question. So this is one of these forgotten little chapters of American history. The gold standard is what's called deflationary. Because the supply of gold doesn't grow very much every year, but at the time in the 1890s, the population was growing by leaps and bounds, the economy was growing by leaps and bounds, but the currency was not. And so what that means is that it's deflationary. So the value of the dollar goes up and up and up every year. It's the opposite of inflation. If you are a banker, or a bondholder, or a capitalist, this is wonderful for you. If you are someone who borrows money, which farmers did at the time and still do today, farmers work on, they're always in debt, right? They have to borrow to make ends meet. This is crushing. You have to pay off your debts in dollars that are worth far more than they were when you borrowed them. So the price of say, corn goes down and down and down and down, but your debts, the burden goes up and up and up. And so you have farmers in the West and farmers in the South are basically approaching a state of debt peonage. I mean, they're in the South. That's where they are. That is what has happened. And getting the country off the gold standard was, a huge part of the problem. And we eventually did do that. We don't have the gold standard anymore. Same is true in Canada. But it became the public sort of embraced this issue in a way that is difficult to understand nowadays and said, no, what we should have is a silver standard because silver is inflationary. There's a lot of it, it comes out of the ground every year. And so it became what they called the Battle of the Standards, where Bryan supported silver and McKinley supported gold. And so
voters actually understood the implications of all this.
Oh, yes. Oh, absolutely. Well, they did very much so. And they also embraced it in a symbolic way. So gold was symbolized by great wealth. Gold was supposed to be the currency of the rich, and silver was supposed to be the currency of average people. Yes, they definitely understood this. Now, for a time at the beginning, after the convention, and Bryan seems to be this man of destiny, and everybody thought he was going to win. It seemed obvious. Look what's coming. It's this tidal wave. But the Republicans were with the campaign that I describe in the book, and the sort of hysteria among the ruling elite of this country, were able to beat him back. I mean, they used every kind of crooked method that you can imagine, but they did it, and they beat Bryan and staved off the challenge of populism.
And the movement kind of fizzled after that. But you write in the book that even if the movement fizzled, many of their demands actually came true and not that much longer. Go about what kind of changes arose out of that.
Oh, well, so if you look at what the populists wanted to do, almost everything on their list later became law, via other politicians and other parties. So, for example, the direct election of senators, they wanted to do that. That happened. The secret ballot, you wouldn't think that's kind of an obvious reform. That happened. And we have that everywhere now. The initiative and referendum, we have that. Votes for women, that happened. Populism was the first, of course, party to endorse that. On their economic issues, we did start breaking up monopolies. It took a couple of years, but we started doing it. We regulated other monopolies like the railroads. We are very strictly regulated in this country. We did go off the gold standard. It didn't happen until 1933, but we did do it. Right down the list, almost everything they wanted to do eventually happened.
You're right that rich people got the income tax. That wasn't true before that.
The first income tax was passed by populists in U.S. Congress, it working with progressives from the other two parties, right before that election. I think 1895. It got struck down immediately by the Supreme Court. Very famous Supreme Court decision. They said this was that the income tax was an act of class war, right? This was the sort of the worst elements of society voting a tax on their betters. And
So you're from Kansas. You know, and because of the book, you've made an extra effort to get to know and talk to people of Kansas. Do people understand that the current right wing politics that so dominates in Kansas and places like there, that the history of their own families there is so different, that so much of what they condemn, these ideas began with their ancestors?
So Paul, this is one of the many.
I should read a book. What's the matter with Kansas? I know. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know what to say. It's one of no, they don't know that. It's that knowledge is lost. There's no monuments to populism except for private ones. If you go on eBay, it's incredibly hard to find any kind of ephemera associated with them. They didn't have any money. I mean, these were very poor people. There's nothing. But as you saw in the book, I was able to hunt down all kinds of hilarious ephemera from the campaign against populism. That's very, very easy to find, and you can buy it on eBay and that sort of thing. But no, there's no collective consciousness of that, and this is one of the problems in American life, is that we don't really. The way that we remember the past is so distorted. Now, we should probably come back to this in episode 2 or 3, the way the word populism got distorted by historians who deliberately decided to twist the word, for their own reasons.
And I think the other thing, in terms of when this movement started to fizzle out, it's really, the beginning of the 20th century is the real rise of finance.
Yeah.
And the real beginning of financialization. And by the 20s, everybody's being sucked into buying into the stock market and borrowing money to buy stocks. And there's this whole frenzy of speculation. Everyone was going to be a wealthy capitalist.
Yeah, the eternal dream. Yeah, the eternal dream. Well, there's a famous article at the time. What is it? Oh my God. Anyone can be a millionaire, or everyone can be a millionaire. I'm sorry. I wrote a book about this long ago called One Market Under God, about this kind of the pseudo-populist promise of that kind of capitalism. And every time it just continually, they suck all these people in and then pull the rug out from under them, But that when they did that in the 20s, it led to a great moment in American life, which is the rise of the New Deal and the labor movement. And real reform.
Okay, that's going to be part 2. So we're going to end this part of the interview. And part 2, we'll keep going historically for now and deal with what populism looks like in the 1930s and the New Deal. And if you read some of the speeches of Roosevelt, particularly this very critical year of 1936, Roosevelt sounds more radical, frankly, than anything you even heard from the populist movement.
Oh, yes.
All right. So join us for part 2 with Thomas Frank on the theAnalysis.news podcast.